Welcome to the 2020 Triduum Retreat, sponsored by the Norbertine Center for Spirituality at St. Norbert Abbey. My name is Tony Pickler, the director of the center. As you can tell, our Triduum Retreat this year is being done in a very different way due to the COVID-19 virus that's sweeping our country and our world. Many thanks to St. Norbert College Parish for allowing us to film these sessions here at Old St. Joseph Church on the college campus. Also special thanks to Tom Tengowski, who will be working his magic behind the curtain, filming these sessions and making all of this technology work for us. And by the way, he is a Faith That Works Award winner from the Catholic Diocese of Green Bay this year. So if you see Tom Tengowski, give him some love. This is the first in a series of 3 reflections, and tonight I'll be focusing on Holy Thursday. It serves as a bit of an homage to the St. Norbert College faculty and staff and students who are unable to be here on campus during these difficult days. We'll examine the ultimate test question from Luke's Gospel, look at the final exam from Matthew's Gospel, and finally, focus on tonight's Gospel, reading from St. John as we look at the review of the exam. You can look for reflections from Father Mike Brennan tomorrow as he focuses on Good Friday and some of the last words of Jesus. And then finally, Kathy Thielot will help us to reflect on the Easter Vigil and the richness of the symbols of that part of our Triduum liturgy. So here we go, the test question, the review, and the final exam. The test question comes from Luke's Gospel, and it's that famous story, one of my favorite stories, the Good Samaritan. If you remember that story, there's a man that comes up to Jesus, and he's got a question of him, and the question is this: Lord, what do I have to do to attain eternal life? And Jesus says, you know the answer to this. You know, as a good Jew, that you need to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You know that. Well, this young man is a student who is probably like one of those students that you might have witnessed in your classes. Maybe a little snarky, a little attitude, comes back at Jesus with the question, so who's my neighbor? And Jesus, being a patient and kind teacher, instead of lashing back out at this young man, he tells him a story. And the story is the story of the Good Samaritan from Luke's Gospel. I was so blessed a few years ago to go to Israel. And on one particular day, we went to the Jordan River and walked and waded in the Jordan. We went to Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then we went to Jericho, the oldest city in the world, and one that is, quite frankly, at the lowest elevation of any place in the world. On our way back from Jericho to Jerusalem, we had some time on our hands. And so the bus driver and the guide for our tour asked, would you want to go to the Valley of the Shadow of Death? And I, quite frankly, didn't know a whole lot about the Valley of the Shadow of Death, but I was really interested and excited to try it out. So our bus pulled up to this place along the road, almost looked like the Grand Canyon. Looking down at this gorge, the guide said, this is the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And all I could think of was those words from Psalm 23. You've probably heard it many times at funerals or at other celebrations, liturgies. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are at my side. Well, it was at the valley of the shadow of death where Jesus had in mind the setting for the story of the Good Samaritan. There was a guy who was walking through this gorge, walking from Jericho to Jerusalem, down this path, and he was beat up by some robbers, left for dead. And as you can see from the photo on the slide, the narrowness of this valley is quite distinct. And so one person, a Levite, a religious leader of his time, came through that valley, probably walking from Jericho to Jerusalem, just as this man had been doing. And he did not stop. He walked around this person, walked around this guy laying in the ditch, bloodied and beaten. And it was almost like he would almost have to step over him. He'd have to make an intentional pass, no doubt seeing him laying there in need. A second person, a priest, walked past, and he too did the same thing. Walked over, walked around, definitely saw him, saw his need, but ignored it. And then there was this third guy, this third person, a Samaritan. Samaritans were hated by Jews. There was this long history of hatred between the Jews from the south and the Samaritans from the north. Went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, it was the Samaritan, this despised person of the person who was probably laying in the ditch, who stops, helps, puts bandages on this bloodied and beaten man, puts him on his donkey, brings him to the nearest inn, and pays for his care. The story of the Good Samaritan at the valley of the shadow of death. Well, Pope Francis commented on this story at one point recently, and he said, in the face of the suffering of so many people destroyed by hunger, by violence, and by injustices, we cannot remain spectators. What does it mean to ignore one's suffering? It means to ignore God. What does it mean to ignore suffering of our neighbor? It means to ignore God. So, who is the neighbor here? The neighbor is both us, the person who reaches out like the Samaritan did, but it's also the person in need. That person who lives next door to us, the woman who is elderly and can't get her groceries during this time of the virus. The neighbor who needs a grocery delivery. It might be the man who lives down the street who can't rake his lawn or do the spring cleanup tasks that he's always done, and he needs your help. It might mean the child in our house who's at home and studying online or through some of the resources that have been sent home from school, and taking that extra time to help them during this time of social distancing. For young people, when you were at school, maybe it was that child in the cafeteria who always sat by themselves and didn't have anybody to eat lunch with. That's the neighbor. The neighbor is the person we see right in front of us who has needs. But the neighbor is also the person who we often do not see. The marginalized, the forgotten, the least of our brothers and sisters in this community that we live in. Who are these neighbors? Who are these neighbors that we don't see? Well, in our states, in the United States of America, we know that there are about 4.8 million Americans who live in poverty. 15% of us. Out of every 100 people, 15 people live in poverty. We know that on any given night, there will be about 500,000 people in the United States who experience homelessness. We know that there are 1.6 million children who have stayed in shelters this past year. We know that Wisconsin ranks 37th in the country in poverty, and when it compared to that 15% of the United States, Wisconsinites have 13% of people who live in poverty. So you might say, wow, we're doing better than national average, but really, not so much better. And this is an interesting point. The poverty line for an individual is $11,100. And for a family of four, $22,300. And what's interesting about that statistic is that those numbers have not changed since 1974. That poverty level was set in 1974. And we know that in today's world, in 2020, it costs a whole lot more to live than it did in 1974. So people, our neighbors, in our community, in communities all over the United States and in Wisconsin, they have needs, they're hurting, they're laying bloodied in the ditch. In our own community, we know that between 90 and 110 people stay at the New Community Shelter on Mather Street every night. We know that between 200 and 250 people eat their dinner there every single night. And on average, over 80 people stay at St. John the Evangelist Homeless Shelter on beds and cots. And we also know that this year, that number has topped out at about 120 to 125 people. Those are our neighbors. We also know that in our community in Brown County, there are over 1,300 homeless children in any given year. We'll talk about that in a minute. Over 200 people eat lunch at the Salvation Army, and we know that there are, at present time, 13 families who stay at Freedom House. We also know they're renovating and building anew so that they can welcome more families, because we also know that there is an incredible waiting list for families living in poverty who need a place to stay. When it comes to the McKinney-Vento Act, this is an act where a law in our states that every single public school system in the United States needs to have a person on staff who works with homeless children and families. By what you can see on the screen, and although these are not this year's statistics, you can see that every single school district in Brown County has at least one child or young person who experiences homelessness. And some school districts, i.e. Green Bay, have over 1,000 children in this situation. But it's not just Green Bay, it's also outlying communities like East Appear and West Appear, Ashwaubenon and Howard Suamico, who have issues with homelessness. These are our neighbors. These are children who are sitting in the desk next to our children. These are children who are playing on the same sports teams or playing in the band, their instruments in the band, or singing in the choir, appearing in the school play. McKinney-Vento stats prove to us that we have neighbors, young neighbors, who are in need, lying in the ditch, needing our help. So that's the big question. That's the test question. Who is our neighbor, and how do we help them? The final exam comes from Matthew's gospel. Matthew 25 is the very, very last passage, the last story, the last teaching, the last instructions of Jesus before his passion, death, and resurrection. Matthew 25 is that famous story of the king that Jesus tells, who is separating at the end of time in a last judgment the sheep from the goats. The sheep are going to go on the right, the goats are going to go on the left. And the people on the right, the sheep, don't know why they're sheep. And the people on the left, the goats, don't know why they're goats. And so Jesus tells them, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me. And they asked, so when? When did we feed you? When did we give you drink? When did we visit you? When did we welcome you? And Jesus says, whenever you did that to the least of my brothers or sisters, you did it to me. That's the final exam. How well do we feed? How well do we give drink? How well do we welcome? How well do we comfort? How well do we visit? That's the final exam. And this famous painting sketch from the Catholic worker movement is called Christ in the Bread Lines. And it clearly shows that it's Jesus in that bread line who needs to be fed. It's Jesus in that bread line amongst all of the other neighbors living on the margins who need our help. Christ and the breadlines. The final exam is how well have we reached out to our brothers and sisters, our neighbor in need. Catholic social teaching has a rich history of drawing from that scripture and brings to us what we call the corporal works of mercy: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison, and burying the dead. That's what we're called to do as Christians. That's what we're called to do for our neighbors. That's what we're called to do to answer the questions and do well on the final exam. So then we get to tonight's gospel, John's gospel. His account of the Last Supper comes from John 13, verses 1 to 15. In this account, Jesus does not take bread and wine and bless and break and distribute to the disciples. That's already happened in John's account. There is no institution of the Eucharist in that way in John's account. In his account, instead, it's after supper. And Jesus takes off his cloak, puts on a simple garment, takes a towel, takes a water basin and a pitcher, and he bends down and he washes each disciple's feet. And after he gets done doing that, he says, you need to do this as well. If you want to be my follower, if you want to be my disciple, you are not to be served, you are to serve. And this is how you do it. This is the review. You know, any good teacher we had in school probably did the same thing that my teachers did. And that was, in preparation for the exam, in preparation for the test, they gave us a review sheet. No surprises, gave you the answers, showed you how to do well on the test. That's what Jesus is doing with this example of washing of feet. He's given us the review for the test. He's showing us exactly what we need to do to succeed, to do well on that final exam, the last judgment. Will we be a sheep? Will we be a goat? It's a story that we recount. It's a story that we reenact every Holy Thursday as we in our parish communities, not this year, but certainly in years to come, we will again do just as Jesus did, to bend down, to wash each other's feet, to be servants, not to be served. There's a great piece from Macrina Whitaker in a book called Seasons of Your Heart, in which she writes a piece called, Would You Mind If I Wash Your Feet? And it goes like this. If Christ should suddenly stand before us with a towel thrown over his shoulder and a pan of water in his hands, would we have the courage to take off our shoes and really let him wash our feet? Or like Peter, would we say, wash my feet, Lord? Never. Well, Christ has stood in front of us on many a day. It hasn't always been a pan of water that he's held in front of us, for water is only one symbol of a way to be cleansed, to be healed, to be refreshed. Sometimes he holds a Bible, or sends a letter or email, or calls us on the phone. Sometimes he holds a loaf of bread or a cup of tea, or gives us a shoulder to cry on. Christ comes in so many ways and so many people, always holding out that basin of water in some form or other, always asking that same embarrassing question, would you mind if I wash your feet? The beautiful thing about that burning, persistent, foot-washing question is that eventually it calls forth the same question from our heart. And we discover that our basin is full of water, and our heart is full of a call to wash feet. So Jesus answers this final question, the ultimate question, in the question of who is my neighbor? He gives us that final exam with the separation of the sheep and the goats and the challenge of the final question. How well did you feed? How well did you give drink? How well did you welcome? How well did you visit? And finally, Jesus gives us the ultimate review question, the ultimate review experience, the washing of feet. Would you mind if I wash your feet? Doing so, serving and not looking to be served, will get us ready for acing the final exam. In closing tonight, I'd like to present to you Marty Hagen's song, a song that we often sing here at St. Norbert College Parish at Old St. Joe. It's called So You Must Do. Jesus, our teacher and our Lord, stooped to wash the feet of his disciples, and he told them, "This is an example, just as I have done, so you must do." And he told them, "This is an example, just as I have done, so you must do." Have a blessed Holy Thursday.